Somewhere deep in a forest in France, a girl began to realize something was wrong. At first, it was just the sound of a bell ringing somewhere between the trees, and every time she stopped to listen, it would disappear like it was never there at all. But the deeper she went into the forest, the more certain she became of one thing. Something was there with her just out of sight. In June of 2019, an 18-year-old girl named Bella was finishing up her first year of college. She was excited to head home for the summer. Her family lived on the outskirts of a small town in France, a place tucked away in the mountains and almost completely surrounded by a massive, dense forest. Growing up there, Bella had spent a huge amount of her childhood exploring that forest. Sometimes she would go by herself, other times with her father, or maybe with her cousins. Over the years, she had come to know the woods like the back of her hand. She knew every trail, every landmark, every quiet little spot. Her absolute favorite place in this entire forest was a small, man-made lake that was situated deep inside, almost at the very center of the woods. It wasn't a very large lake, but the view was breathtaking and it was always incredibly peaceful. It was her go-to spot to clear her head. Getting there was a little ritual she had perfected over the years. She would leave her house, get into her small car, and drive for a couple of miles down a quiet country road. At a very specific, unmarked spot, she would pull over onto the gravel shoulder. There were no signs, no designated parking area. It was just a place she and her family had discovered, a hidden gateway to their part of the forest. After parking, she'd get out, and instead of walking along the road, she would turn and walk directly into the line of trees that grew right up against the shoulder. The underbrush was thick for the first few feet, but it quickly opened up into a small clearing. Just ahead, she would see a little stream trickling through the woods. To the left of this stream, there was what looked like a worn-out footpath, but it wasn't a human trail. It was an animal trail, a path carved out over years and years by deer and other wildlife making their way through the forest. Bella would walk down to this animal path and follow it as it ran parallel to the stream. She'd walk for about 15 or 20 minutes, just enjoying the quiet sounds of nature until the path took a sharp turn to the left, heading away from the water. At that point, Bella would leave the animal trail behind. She'd continue walking straight, following the stream north, deeper and deeper into the heart of the forest. This part of the journey involved stepping carefully on mossy rocks in the stream and walking along the muddy banks on either side. It was a slower pace, and it would take her about an hour of steady walking before the stream eventually met up with a much larger river that ran from east to west. When she reached this river, Bella would turn left, heading west, and follow the riverbank for another 20 minutes or so. And then, finally, the river would open up and feed directly into her destination, the man-made lake. She would find a comfortable rock to sit on, watch the animals, listen to the wind in the trees, and just feel totally at peace. To get back, she would just retrace her steps exactly. The whole trip, one way, from her car to the lake, took about 2 hours. A big part of why Bella loved this place so much was because it felt like it belonged to her and her family. In all her years of coming out here, the only other people she had ever seen in this part of the forest or anywhere near the lake were members of her own family. It was their secret, their private sanctuary. So, in June of that year, when Bella finally came home from college, one of the first things she wanted to do was go out to the lake. She hadn't been in months because of school, and she was really missing her happy place. One morning, she got up early, told her parents where she was headed, and set out by herself. She got in her car, drove the familiar couple of miles, and pulled over onto the gravel shoulder. She got out, turned away from the road, and walked into the forest. She found the stream, then the animal path beside it. She walked for a few minutes until the trail cut to the left, and just as she always did, she stayed with the stream, continuing her journey north. About 30 minutes later, when she was still a good mile or two away from the east-west river, she heard something. It was a bell. Somewhere off in the distance, far ahead of her, she heard a single clear chime. As soon as she heard it, she stopped dead in her tracks. That was wrong. There were never any people out here. Ever. And that sound, a bell, had to come from a person or something a person had made. She stood perfectly still, listening, wondering if she had imagined it. It could have just been a strange sound, her mind playing tricks on her in the silence of the woods. She waited. And then she heard it again. But this time, it wasn't a single chime. The bell started ringing continuously. It wasn't a steady, rhythmic ringing, though. It was sporadic and uneven, almost frantic, like someone holding a bell and just shaking it randomly at a sports game. Her mind started racing, trying to figure out what it could be. Maybe a dog had gotten lost out here and it had a bell on its collar. But as she listened, she realized the sound was too loud, too resonant. It wasn't the tiny jingle of a pet's bell. This was something bigger, more substantial. She thought of other, stranger possibilities. Maybe someone had a bell in a box, and the box fell into the river upstream and was now floating down, hitting rocks and causing the sound. She was coming up with all these weird scenarios, but honestly, she wasn't scared. She was just incredibly curious. Since the sound of the bell seemed to be coming from the direction she was already heading, she decided to just keep walking. She wanted to see for herself what was making that noise. So Bella started walking along the stream again, her ears tuned to the constant random ringing up ahead. She was completely focused on it, trying to pinpoint its exact location. And then, after about 5 more minutes of walking, the bell just stopped. It went completely silent. The sudden absence of the sound was actually more startling than the sound itself. She stopped again, listening intently, expecting it to start up again, but it didn't. All she could hear now were the normal sounds of the forest, the stream, the birds, the wind. Bella had no explanation for the bell or why it had stopped, but she wasn't really worried about it. She figured there had to be a logical explanation for it, even if she couldn't think of one. So she just shrugged it off, put her focus back on her hike, and kept walking toward the lake. About 10 or 15 minutes later, Bella was still making her way along the stream. She was getting closer to the east-west river, maybe only a half-mile away now. That's when she saw something up ahead on the left bank of the stream. It was a dark lump on the ground. At first, she couldn't tell what it was. It could have been a strangely shaped rock or maybe an animal. As she got closer, she realized it was a beaver lying motionless on the ground, and this beaver was missing its head. Now, this was a huge forest, and Bella knew perfectly well that it was full of wild animals. Finding the body of an animal that had been killed by a predator wasn't unusual. That was just nature. But as she stood over it, something struck her as deeply wrong. The cut on the beaver's neck was incredibly neat and uniform. It looked like its head had been very carefully removed with an extremely sharp knife. And the beaver's head was nowhere in sight. This definitely didn't look like the work of a predator. The teeth and claws of an animal would have left a ragged, torn mess. Also, the rest of the beaver's body was completely untouched. Whatever had killed it clearly wasn't interested in eating it. As Bella stood there staring down at the bizarre sight, she also noticed there was no smell. Usually, when an animal dies, the process of decomposition starts quickly and it creates a very distinct odor. The lack of any smell told Bella that this beaver must have been killed very, very recently. Then she gently nudged the body with the toe of her shoe and saw that it was still fairly limp. Rigor mortis, the stiffening of the body that happens shortly after death, hadn't set in yet. As all these facts clicked into place in her mind, a cold realization washed over her. This beaver had died only a short time ago, which meant that whoever or whatever had killed it was probably still somewhere nearby. And then Bella couldn't help but connect the dead beaver to the bell she had heard earlier. Before, the bell was just a curiosity. But now, considering the sound had come from the same general area where this freshly killed and decapitated beaver was now lying, it made her deeply uneasy. Her head snapped up, and she found herself frantically scanning the trees, her eyes darting in every direction. She was looking for a person, maybe a hunter, someone who could explain what was going on. But she saw nothing. There was no movement, no sound, just the dense, silent woods. She felt a wave of panic begin to rise in her chest, but she forced herself to stop. She took a deep breath and told herself to calm down. It was broad daylight. She had been coming to these woods her entire life and had never seen another person, never had a dangerous encounter with an animal. She was sure everything was fine. She had to be overreacting. She had nothing to worry about. So she took another deep breath, carefully stepped over the beaver's body, and kept on walking. Eventually, Bella reached the East-West River. She made the left turn and walked the final 20 minutes along its bank until she reached the man-made lake. She sat for a while, enjoying the beautiful view and the familiar scenery, trying to push the image of the beaver out of her mind. After some time, she got up, turned around, and began the long walk back. She passed the spot where the beaver was still lying on the ground, walked all the way back to her car, and went home, feeling a little unsettled, but mostly okay. A week went by. Bella was at home feeling bored and restless. On an impulse, she decided that the only cure for her boredom was a trip back to the place she loved most, the man-made lake. She told her parents where she was going, and then she left the house. It was already 6 p.m. when she got in her car, drove to the pull-off, parked, and entered the woods. Sunset that night was at 9, so Bella knew she couldn't linger. This would have to be a quick trip if she wanted to avoid being caught in the forest after dark. She found the animal trail and started her journey along the stream. She followed it until the trail veered left, and then she continued along the stream bed. As she was walking, she started to hear the distant rumble of thunder. She looked up through the canopy of leaves and could see the sky was growing dark, much darker than it should be. It was still a couple of hours before sunset, so she knew a storm was rolling in. But Bella was determined. She was not going to turn back. She wanted to get to that lake. So instead of heading back to her car, she did the opposite. She started jogging along the stream, trying to get there as fast as she possibly could. Almost as soon as she picked up her pace, the first raindrops began to fall. By the time she passed the spot where the beaver corpse had been lying on the ground, it hadn't moved, the rain was really coming down. About 15 minutes after she passed the corpse, she finally reached the East-West River. By this point, the rain had turned into a full-blown downpour. Still, Bella was resolute. She turned left at the river and continued west, intending to go all the way to the lake. But after only a minute or two of walking along the river, with about 20 minutes still left to go, she stopped herself. She looked at her watch and saw that it was already after 8 o'clock. She started thinking it through logically. If she turned around right now, it would still take her over an hour to get back to her car. Sunset was at 9. It was already past 8. That meant, best case scenario, she was going to have to navigate the last part of her journey in the dark. And if she went all the way to the lake first, then she would be walking in the pitch-black forest for maybe up to an hour. She was confident she could probably do it, but it was also pouring rain and she was cold and soaked. If she got lost or twisted an ankle, this could turn into a very bad situation very quickly. So, as much as she wanted to keep going, she made the sensible decision. She needed to turn around and head back. She turned and began walking back along the East-West River toward the spot where the stream fed into it. She turned south and started making her way along the stream back toward her car. Because it was getting so dark and the rain was so heavy, visibility was terrible. She kept her head down, watching the ground, trying not to trip. She was carefully placing her feet on rocks and muddy patches, making sure her footing was solid. The rain was pounding all around her. She had been walking like this for about 15 minutes when, all of a sudden, something hit her hard on the top of her head. Reflexively, she cried out and looked up, throwing her hands in front of her face to protect herself. And then she saw what she had just run into. It was the beaver corpse. It was hanging from a string, dangling from a tree branch directly over the path. And its head, which had been missing before, had been found. It had been crudely stitched onto the beaver's own front paws. So she was looking at this grotesque dangling puppet of a beaver carrying its own head, and she had walked right into it. Her first reaction was to gag. She felt like she was going to vomit right there. She was so disgusted. Then she started frantically rubbing at her hair where the wet, decomposing thing had touched her, terrified that some fluid from it had gotten on her. After a moment of panicked scrubbing, she stopped. And something truly terrifying dawned on her. Whoever had strung this beaver up in this tree and had taken the time to stitch its head onto its paws had done it in the last 30 minutes. Because just 30 minutes earlier, on her way in, she specifically remembered seeing the beaver carcass on the ground. She saw it. It was in the same spot it had been a week ago. And now, here it was, hanging from a tree. As the wheels turned in her head, Bella came to a chilling conclusion. If someone had just done this, then that someone was probably still here. They were probably nearby. At this point, it was getting really dark. The rain was hammering down, and she felt completely exposed. She started whipping her head around, trying to peer through the downpour into the dark woods, searching for anyone who might have done this. But all she could see was the dark, blurry shape of the forest in every direction. She knew she was at least an hour away from her car, even if she ran. Suddenly, she was totally and completely panicked. In a desperate effort to calm herself down, she whispered to herself, "Okay, I need to get out of here, but I have to walk. If I start running, I'll fall, I'll get lost, this will turn into a nightmare. Just walk. Try to walk." So she took a shaky breath, walked around the dangling beaver corpse, and started moving along the stream again. But as soon as she was past it, she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She could hear movement behind her. A rustling sound. She didn't know what it was. It could have been a deer, just some animal startled by the storm. But she was far too afraid to turn around and look. And even though she was telling herself to stay calm, to just keep walking, that she was safe and just freaking herself out, she could feel her pace quickening. Her walk turned into a jog, and then finally she broke into a full-on sprint, running down the stream away from that beaver and whatever was moving in the trees behind her. At some point, maybe 5 or 6 minutes after seeing the beaver, she was so out of breath from sprinting that she had to slow down to a walk. As soon as she slowed down, still without turning around, she heard it again. The sound of that bell. It was the exact same sound she had heard the week before, that constant, sporadic ringing. But in her panic state, she couldn't tell where it was coming from. Her anxiety was so high, her heart was pounding so loud, she didn't know if it was behind her, or to the side, or all around her. It was now completely dark, and she was full-blown terrified. There was someone or something behind her, the person who had strung up that beaver, and they were probably watching her right now. Even though she was beyond exhausted and could barely breathe, she started sprinting again as fast as her legs would carry her. She stumbled and fell on the slippery rocks. She tripped over roots, not even looking where she was going anymore. And in the background, all around her, she could hear that bell chiming, and she could hear something crashing through the woods behind her. She fumbled in her pocket and pulled out her iPhone. As she was running, she managed to dial her father. She pressed the phone to her ear, crying, panting, gasping for air. Her father picked up, and she was so relieved to hear his voice, but she couldn't even form a sentence. She just started wailing, pleading with him. "Dad, come out to the forest! Meet me at the spot where the trail veers away from the stream. Meet me there. There's someone in the forest, they're chasing me, and I can't see them. Her father, on the other end of the line, didn't know what to make of it, but he could hear the pure primal fear in his daughter's voice. He didn't waste time with questions. He just said, "Stay on the line. I'm coming to meet you right now." Bella's father and mother, with Bella still on the phone with them, ran out of their house. They jumped in their car and sped the couple of miles down the road. They parked next to their daughter's car, and as they were getting out, they could hear it. Way off in the woods, they could hear the faint sound of the bell. They could hear their daughter screaming on the phone, and they could hear that same bell sound coming through the phone's speaker. She was begging them, "Please, come into the woods, come in here, save me." Her parents ran into the woods and started charging up the stream. Meanwhile, Bella was still deep in the forest, still 10 or 15 minutes away from them. She could barely run anymore. She had used up almost all of her energy. And as she got closer and closer to where her parents would be, the sporadic ringing of the bell was getting louder and louder and louder. Whatever it was gaining on her. She could hear sticks and branches snapping right behind her, as if something was just feet away. Finally, when it felt like the bell was ringing right behind her head, she just stopped. It was a moment of complete defeat. She was too far away from her parents. She wasn't going to make it to them in time. It was almost as if she felt she had no choice but to turn around and finally see whatever it was that was hunting her. So, terrified beyond words, so scared and so tired she could barely breathe, Bella slowly turned around. When she turned, she found herself facing a small clearing she had just run past. Because it was a clearing, a little bit of moonlight was able to filter down through the trees, just enough to illuminate the space, which was about 50 feet across. As she looked across this clearing, at first she saw nothing. And then a tall, dark figure walked into the clearing from the trees on the other side. As soon as it stepped into the faint light, she could see it had a bell tied at its waist. With every single step it took, its leg would strike the bell, causing that violent ringing sound. This thing started moving across the clearing, and as Bella stared at it, it was like time slowed down. She couldn't process what she was seeing. She didn't know what it was. All she knew was that whatever or whoever this was, it was coming straight for her. And then, suddenly, Bella felt an unbelievable rush of adrenaline. It was like her body went into autopilot, a pure survival instinct. She turned around and began sprinting faster than she had ever sprinted in her entire life. And as she ran, all she could hear was the sound of that bell, which she now understood was the sound of its steps. The bell was getting faster and faster, louder and louder. She knew it was gaining on her. She started screaming out loud, lying, "I'm on the phone with the police! They're right up ahead. They're going to be here any second." But whatever was behind her wasn't fazed. It just kept charging forward, closing the distance second by second. Meanwhile, her parents had made it to the meeting spot. But her father couldn't just stand there and wait. He started charging deeper into the woods towards the sounds. He could hear his daughter's screams, he could hear the bell getting louder and louder, and he just ran straight towards it. And sure enough, just seconds later, he saw his daughter compounding out of the dark forest. She saw him and leaped into his arms. He grabbed her, turned around, and ran with her back to the meeting spot. He grabbed his wife, and the three of them just charged out of the forest, back to the parking lot, back into their car. And they sped away. In the car, all of them were crying. They had no idea what to make of what had just happened. Bella was trying to describe what she saw, but she couldn't get the words out. Her parents had been on the phone listening to their daughter's terrified screams, and all they kept saying to each other was, "I heard the bell. I heard the bell. I heard the bell." That sound confirmed their worst nightmares. There really was someone or something out in those woods that was trying to harm their child. They drove straight to the police station, where Bella filed a report about everything she had experienced in the forest. Afterwards, as a precaution, her parents took her to the hospital. She was determined to be physically okay, besides some bumps and bruises from falling. The following morning, the police went out to the forest. They went to the area Bella had described and conducted a thorough search all along the animal trail and the stream. But they never found any sign of this tall, dark figure with the bell. Bella had told the police that she was carrying a handbag and that she had dropped it while she was running. She remembered exactly where along the stream she had dropped it, but when the police searched that area, the bag was gone. Also, the beaver was no longer there. It wasn't tied to the tree, and it wasn't on the ground. It had vanished. The only thing the police found that was out of the ordinary was a t-shirt. A little ways off from the stream, basically along the path Bella would have been running, they found a t-shirt that was neatly folded and placed carefully underneath a rock. But the police, Bella and her family, had no idea what that was supposed to mean. Ultimately, the police told Bella and her family that more than likely what she had run into was some kind of mentally unstable person who was living out in the woods. Perhaps when Bella came into the forest, this person felt like she was trespassing on their property, and so they tried to scare her away. But Bella has a very hard time accepting that explanation. She felt with every fiber of her being that as she was running from whoever was behind her, she was in mortal danger. She believes that if her father hadn't run into the woods and literally grabbed her and carried her the rest of the way, she might not have gotten out of there at all. She might have been attacked and killed by whatever that was. And when she looks back on the experience, she can't help but think about that moment when she turned around and looked across that clearing. When she saw that figure step into the moonlight for the first time, she remembers that the way it was moving, the steps it was taking, they weren't normal. They were abnormal, disjointed. There was something so off about its movement that for a second, it didn't even seem like she was looking at a person, but maybe some kind of large animal. Since her ordeal, there have been no other strange sightings reported in those woods. But then again, almost no one ever goes into that part of the forest except for Bella and her family. And Bella and her family, they don't go in those woods anymore. So whoever or whatever is out there is still just out there. The police never found anyone or anything in that forest. No trace of the shadow. No trace of the beaver. Nothing. It's just an empty forest and the sound of a bell that no one can fully explain. To this day, Bella and her family refuse to ever go near that forest again. Because anything out there has never proven that it has left. Strongsville, Ohio used to be one of those quiet, comfortable suburbs you see all over America. A place with nice homes, nice families, and a local mall. But in late 2017, something was discovered there that put the town on the map for all the wrong reasons. And to really understand what happened, we need to go back to early 2016, which is when this town's long nightmare really began. In early 2016, a couple named Bruce and Melinda Pleskovich, who had lived in Strongsville for a long time, got some very exciting news. Their 20-year-old daughter Anna and her 20-year-old fiancé, a young man named Jeff, had just told them they were expecting a baby. It was going to be a little girl. And so, Bruce and Melinda were absolutely thrilled. They were finally going to be grandparents. But at the same time, they were a little worried. They knew that Anna and Jeff didn't have a lot of money. Anna was still living at home with her parents. She had a job as a waitress at the local Applebee's, but it didn't pay much. And as for Jeff, he had a decent job. He was a service technician for a heating and air company, but it wasn't enough to support a new family. In fact, he was still living with his own parents on the other side of town. So here you had this young couple so excited about their new baby, but Bruce and Melinda knew they needed some help. They knew their kids just weren't financially prepared for this huge step. So Bruce and Melinda talked it over. They decided the best way they could support Anna and Jeff was to make them an offer. They told Anna that she could invite Jeff to come and live with them in their house, That way, the two of them could be together, and once the baby was born, Bruce and Melinda could be right there to help out. It seemed like the perfect solution. It would let the young couple save up their money so they could eventually get a place of their own. When they told Anna about their plan, she was so happy and so grateful. She immediately called Jeff, and he was just as thrilled. He said yes, he would love to move in. So it took a few months to get everything sorted out, but finally, in June of 2016, Jeff moved out of his parents' house and into the Pleskovic home. And it was in that very same month that Anna and Jeff welcomed their baby daughter into the world. But almost as soon as Jeff moved in, some really strange and disturbing things started happening around the property. Just a few days after Jeff had settled in, he and Anna were home alone. They were on the main floor, having dinner at the kitchen table. At some point, Jeff just happened to glance out one of the back windows that looked out into their backyard. Now, their property had this huge, sprawling backyard. It was almost like a big, open, communal space shared by a row of houses. So Jeff is looking out into this big yard, and he sees something strange off in the distance. It was dark out, so he couldn't quite make it out at first. He stood up and walked over to the window for a better look. And as he got closer, he could see them. Way off at the back edge of their property, there were 4 strangers. They were just standing there, looking like they were smoking something, and they were all staring up at the Pleskovic house. Jeff just stood there at the window, watching them, not sure what to think. He called Anna over to the window, and she came and stood next to him. The two of them are just looking out, trying to figure out what to do. On one hand, these 4 people they didn't know were clearly trespassing on their property. But on the other hand, they weren't really doing anything aggressive. They were just standing there, smoking and staring. Hot was then as they watched, one of the 4 people started walking up the property straight towards their house. The person stopped next to the family's trampoline, which was in the backyard, and started fiddling with it. At that point, Anna had seen enough. She said she didn't know what they were doing, but she felt totally uncomfortable. So she decided to call the police. The police came out, but by the time the squad car pulled up in front of the house, the 4 people in the back must have seen the flashing lights. They had taken off running. When the officer went into the backyard to look around, there was nobody there. And there was no sign that they had been there either. No cigarette butts, no footprints, nothing. They had just vanished into the night. The police officer told Jeff and Anna to call again if they came back, and then he left. A little while later, Bruce and Melinda got home, and Anna and Jeff told them what had happened. They all agreed it was incredibly strange. In all the decades they had lived in that house in Strongsville, they had never had anyone just wander onto their property and hang out in the middle of the night. For the next couple of days, the whole family was on edge, constantly checking the windows. But after a little while, as more time passed, the incident was mostly forgotten. Fast forward about 5 months to November of 2016. Anna was home alone one day with her young daughter. She was on the first floor towards the front of the house, playing with the baby, and as she was playing, she suddenly heard a sound coming from the back of the house. It sounded like someone was trying to open the sliding glass door. Her first thought was that it must be Jeff or one of her parents. Maybe they forgot their key or something. So she scooped up her daughter and started walking towards the back of the house to let them in. She walked into one of the back rooms, and before she even reached the door, she happened to look out one of the windows that faced the backyard. And what she saw made her freeze. Standing right there, with his face pressed up against the glass, was an unknown man. He was just staring into the house. Anna just stood there, completely frozen, staring back at him. Then the guy noticed her. He immediately ducked down out of view. Anna's mind was racing. This must have been the person who was trying to break in through the back door. She was home alone with her baby, and she had no idea what this man wanted or if he was going to try to break in again. So she just turned and ran. She ran back towards the front of the house, up the stairs, and into a bedroom. She locked the door behind her and called the police. But again, by the time the police arrived and searched the area, they couldn't find anyone. There was no sign of an attempted forced entry on the door either. The officers told her that they were sure it was a traumatic experience, but there was really nothing they could do. There was no evidence, and they had no idea who it could have been. They just told her to keep her doors locked and to call them back if she saw anyone suspicious on her property again. Naturally, after the police left, Anna called Jeff and her parents. They were horrified and rushed home to comfort her. After the initial shock wore off, the family started to wonder. They thought, do you think this could be connected to those 4 strangers they saw on the property a few months ago? It just seemed too weird to be a coincidence. But then that led to the bigger question, who were these people and what did they want? Why were they targeting their family? As far as they knew, the Pleskovic family didn't have any enemies. In fact, most people in Strongsville absolutely adored them, especially Melinda, the mother. For over 20 years, Melinda had been a middle school teacher in town, and her students loved her. She was also a huge part of the local soccer community. She had played in college and was still really passionate about it, so she was an amazing coach. And for many of the parents in Strongsville, Melinda was an inspiration. She wasn't just a mother to Anna, she was also the mother of an 18-year-old boy named Kyle who had Down syndrome and was nonverbal. And Melinda just had this unbelievable way with him. She was so good to him, she included him in everything, and she gave him the best possible life. Anytime you saw Kyle with his mother, he was just beaming with happiness. Even though he couldn't speak, it was so obvious how much he loved his mom. But regardless of who these strangers were or why they were lurking around, the Pleskovic family was now completely on edge. They found themselves constantly looking out the windows, especially at night, terrified that these people were going to come back and try to break in again. And unfortunately, they did come back. In January of 2017, just 2 months after Anna saw that man at the window, Bruce's car was broken into. It had been parked in their driveway. Someone got inside and stole his laptop. So Bruce called the police again. He told them he was sure this was connected to the people who were harassing his family. The police seemed to believe him, and they started looking around and asking questions, but they never found the laptop or the person who took it. And so once again, the family was left on their own, and the police just said to let them know if anything else happened. A few months went by, and then in July of that year, Anna, Jeff, and their daughter were all home together one night. Anna happened to look out one of the back windows on the first floor. And there they were again. Out at the very back of the property, in the exact same spot where she and Jeff had seen those 4 strangers a year before, were 3 more strangers. They were just standing there, looking up at the house. Horrified, Anna called out to Jeff, telling him there were people in the backyard. This time, Anna pulled out her phone and started calling the police. But as she was on the phone, Jeff got really upset. He was tired of these people harassing his family and making them feel unsafe in their own home. So he grabbed a flashlight and stormed out the back door to confront them himself. But as soon as Jeff stepped outside, before he could even shine the light on them, the 3 people turned and ran, vanishing into the darkness. So when the police finally showed up, they were already well aware of all the calls they'd been getting from this family. They went out and did a serious search of the area, but just like every other time, they found nothing. And so the family was told, once again, to call if they saw anything else. The very next month, in August, Anna was home with her daughter. Her mother, Melinda, was upstairs. Anna was in the playroom at the front of the house with the baby when she heard it again. That familiar sound of someone trying to open the back sliding glass door. Immediately, her heart started pounding. She knew what happened the last time she heard that sound. But she thought to herself, okay, I can't just immediately call the police. I need to at least look and see if it's someone I know. So she picked up her daughter, stood up, and walked to the edge of the room she was in. She carefully peeked her head around the corner, down the hallway that gave her a clear view of the back sliding glass door. And when she finally saw who was there, she screamed. There were two large adults standing at the back door, actively trying to force it open. When she screamed, the two strangers heard her. They turned around and took off running. Melinda, who was upstairs, heard her daughter screaming and came flying down the stairs, trying to figure out what was wrong. Anna was hysterical, the baby was crying, and so Melinda was the one who called the police, this time to report what her daughter had just seen. The police came out, they searched the property, and they couldn't find anyone. So again, the police left. They told the family they were sorry this was happening, but they couldn't do anything without more evidence. They promised they would get out there as fast as they could if anything else happened, hoping that one of these times they would finally catch these people. But for now, they just didn't have much to go on. The next month, in September, one of Melinda's car keys went missing. And whoever had stolen it started using it to randomly start her car in the middle of the night. They also used it to set off her car alarm at all hours. During that same time, they also discovered that someone had jammed nails into the tires of Bruce's car. Of course, the family called the police and told them what was going on, but there was still nothing the police could do. Melinda was getting desperate. So she actually went on Facebook and made a post telling everyone that someone had stolen her keys and pleading for them to just give them back. In the post, she begged whoever was harassing her family to just leave them alone. But unfortunately, the post didn't do any good. The harassment continued. A month later, on October 19th, Jeff was home alone when he heard the sound of the back sliding glass door rattling. Now, he knew that every time Anna had heard that sound, there was always some stranger at the back door. So, Jeff grabbed the family dog and he very carefully peered down the hallway towards the back door to see who was there. And right as he poked his head out, he saw him. It was a large adult figure wearing a hood, trying to open the door. The dog saw the person and started barking, running towards the door. Jeff ran after the dog. The person outside, trying to break in, saw the dog and Jeff running towards him, so he turned and ran away. Jeff and the dog stayed inside the house and just watched the guy take off across the property and disappear into the trees. Jeff called the police, but just like all the other times, they came out, and there was simply nothing they could do. Just 4 days later, on October 23rd, Jeff, along with his young daughter and Bruce, went to the local Applebee's where Anna worked. They were going to have dinner there and have Anna be their waitress. After they finished eating, they said their goodbyes to Anna, left the restaurant, got in their cars, and drove back to the house. When they got there, Bruce was the first one up the steps to the front door. It was locked, so he knocked. His son Kyle came and unlocked the door for him. Bruce went inside, followed closely by Jeff, who was carrying his daughter. They got inside, and Bruce walked through the house to the kitchen at the back. He flipped on the lights, and he saw something on the kitchen floor. When Jeff saw it, he immediately turned around and ran out of the house, carrying his daughter. He grabbed Kyle on the way out and just took them straight outside. Once Jeff was safely outside, he called 911. And when you listen to the recording of that call, it sounds like Jeff is in total shock, unable to even process what he has just seen. He told the operator that someone had been attacked in his house. He said it was Mel Pleskovich. He said he didn't know who did it, that they just came home and found her on the kitchen floor. Jeff and Bruce had just discovered Melinda. She was lying on the kitchen floor. She had been stabbed over 35 times and shot 3 times. She was rushed to the hospital, but she would die that night. The whole family was in shock, completely unable to process what had just happened. But they were all convinced of one thing. Whoever had done this to Melinda had to be connected to all of those strange and suspicious people who had been lurking around their property for almost 2 years. In fact, right after Jeff called 911, while he was still inside the kitchen kneeling next to his dying wife, Bruce made his own call to 911, and in it, he blamed the police department for not doing more. He told the operator to please come, that he thought his wife had been killed by someone. He said they'd had people breaking into their house all year, and now someone had killed her. The Strongsville Police Department came out in full force for this case, and they would solve it in just 4 days. And when they finally went public with who killed Melinda, no one in the community could believe it. It turns out that on October 23rd, the night Melinda was found, Jeff had been at the house with her, her son Kyle, and his own young daughter. At some point that evening, before he went to Applebee's, Jeff had put his daughter down in her playpen. Then he went into the kitchen where Melinda was. He walked up to her, pulled out a knife, and stabbed her over and over again more than 35 times. Then, when Melinda fell to the ground, Jeff pulled out a gun and shot her 3 more times, just to make sure she was dead. And while he was doing this, his own daughter was just a few feet away in her playpen, and Kyle was also nearby, completely unable to understand the horror that was happening to his mother. With these 2 innocent children so close by, Jeff cleaned off his weapons. He took off his bloody clothes and hid everything inside of his car. Then he just scooped up his daughter and left the house, leaving Kyle all alone inside with his dying mother on the kitchen floor. He just left him there, shut the door, locked it, and then drove with his daughter to Applebee's to have a perfectly normal dinner with Melinda's husband and daughter. After several hours, when they got back to the house, Jeff knew exactly what was waiting for them inside. And he still let Bruce go in first to be the one to discover his own dying wife on the kitchen floor. Very little is known about why Jeff did this, because Jeff has never given his motive for the crime. The main theory is that Jeff was in serious financial trouble. The wedding was just a couple of days away, and he wasn't going to be able to pay for it. The wedding venue had apparently called Melinda to let her know that they were canceling the wedding because her future son-in-law couldn't afford it. And so, the theory goes, Melinda confronted Jeff about his money problems, and he just snapped and killed her. But that can't possibly be the whole story, because it would turn out that Jeff was responsible for every single suspicious event that had taken place around the Pleskovic property leading up to the murder. That means every time they saw strangers lurking in the backyard, or every time someone was trying to break into the house, it was all because of Jeff. Either it was literally Jeff himself outside, pretending to be a suspicious person, or he had asked his friends or even hired people to go onto the property and pretend to be stalking the family. Other times, Jeff was the only one who supposedly saw these people, and then miraculously, by the time anyone else looked, they were gone. He was lying. A childhood friend of Jeff's, who was living in the area when this all happened, said that the generally accepted reason in Strongsville for why Jeff did this was because he hated Melinda. Even though she had opened up her home to him, he loathed her. And as soon as he moved in back in 2016, he started plotting to kill her. All of those suspicious events, all of that harassment, it was all Jeff's attempt to build this incredibly intricate alibi. He wanted to create this narrative that a group of dangerous strangers was targeting the family. That way, when he finally killed Melinda, everyone would think it was them. And at first, it worked perfectly. Everyone believed it, from the police to the family to their friends. Everyone thought that strangers had finally broken into the house and killed Melinda. There was so little suspicion on Jeff immediately after her murder that he actually served as a pallbearer at Melinda's funeral. But ultimately, the police would discover the knife and the bloody clothes hidden in the back of Jeff's car. They arrested him and presented him with a mountain of evidence. And Jeff confessed to killing Melinda. However, he wouldn't give any additional information about the crime. He just said yes, he did it. He also never offered any kind of apology or explanation to the family. He was ultimately sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 33 years. During Jeff's trial, there was a completely heartbreaking moment when Bruce, Melinda's husband, spoke. He said that their son, Kyle, doesn't understand that his mother is gone. And so now, every time they go out to eat, which is something Kyle loves to do and used to love doing with his mother, he'll just sit and stare out the window. He just sits there, eagerly expecting his mother to show up at any minute. But of course, she never does. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. On the morning of Saturday, the 18th of November, 1961, a 23-year-old man named Michael Rockefeller grabbed the starter cord on his boat's small outboard motor and yanked it hard. The engine sputtered once and died. He tried again. Nothing. With every failed attempt, Michael and his small crew drifted farther away from the coast of New Guinea and deeper into the waters of the Arafura Sea. And the dead engine wasn't even their biggest problem. Their boat, a 40-foot catamaran built from two massive handcrafted canoes tied together, was rapidly taking on water. It was sinking. Just minutes earlier, everything had been going according to plan. Michael and his companions had been traveling along the dense, jungle-covered coastline of New Guinea on their way to visit the Asmat tribe. But to reach them, they had to cross a dangerous stretch of water where a muddy river emptied into the sea. The collision of the river current and the ocean created violent, unpredictable waves. As their boat entered the rough water, wave after wave crashed over the sides, flooding the deck and killing the engine. Now, stranded miles from shore in a sinking boat, Michael Rockefeller was about to disappear into one of the most disturbing mysteries of the 20th century. What had brought him to this remote corner of the world was an obsession with the artwork created by the Asmat people, especially their sacred sculptures known as bispoles. He was completely obsessed with the artwork created by the Asmat people, especially their unique and sacred sculptures known as bispoles. These weren't just simple carvings. They were incredibly intricate works created by master carvers within the tribe. They would take a single massive piece of wood and painstakingly etch it away until it looked like a column of human figures, one standing on the shoulders of the next. The poles were beautiful and powerful to look at, but to the Asmat, they weren't made for display. They believed these poles contained the souls of warriors from their tribe who had been killed in combat. And until the tribe avenged the deaths of those warriors, essentially by killing their enemies in return, those souls would remain trapped within the wood. This meant the Asmat never sold them or got rid of them. These poles were a fundamental part of their culture and their spiritual world. Months before this trip, Michael had visited the Asmat tribe. He had learned all about the bispoles and what they represented. He believed he had successfully negotiated a deal to acquire one. He would trade his modern goods, things the tribe couldn't get, for one of their sacred poles. Michael had given them everything he promised, but the tribe had never sent the pole. So now he was on his way back. He was determined to claim the artifact he felt he had rightfully bartered for. But as he sat in his sinking boat, watching the shoreline of New Guinea become a distant green line, the bispole was the last thing on his mind. He just needed to figure out how to survive. There were 3 other people on the boat with him. There was a French anthropologist named René and 2 teenage guides who were actually from the Asmat region themselves. Their names were Simon and Leo. After Michael failed to get the engine running, René tried, then Simon, then Leo. They all yanked on the pull cord until their arms were sore, but the motor was dead. Finally, Simon and Leo, who knew these waters better than anyone, spoke up. They told Michael and René that their only option was to abandon the catamaran. They needed to jump into the water and swim for shore. At that moment, the coast was about half a mile away, which was a long swim but doable. The problem was they were drifting so fast that if they waited much longer, the distance would become impossible. René, however, was not a strong swimmer. And Michael, for his part, wasn't ready to give up on the expedition just yet. The catamaran was loaded with all the goods he had brought for bartering. He had bundles of tobacco, spools of fishing line, clothes, candy, and steel tools. He knew the tribe didn't have these things, and he saw them as his leverage, not just for the bis pole, but for other unique pieces of art they might have. Even though he knew the boat and everything on it was going to sink eventually, he just couldn't bring himself to abandon it all right then and there. So, a new plan was formed. The two teenage guides, Simon and Leo, would make the swim alone. They would go for help, while Michael and Renee stayed with the sinking vessel. A few moments later, the two young men slipped over the side and began their long, arduous swim towards the shore. As Michael watched them go, it must have dawned on him just how far he was from his own world. It had been months since he had a proper shower. He was caked in dirt and salt, his skin was sunburned, and his hands were rough and calloused from paddling. This was not the life he was born into. Because Michael wasn't from New Guinea. He was from America, and his family was one of the wealthiest, most powerful families in the history of the world. He was a Rockefeller. His grandfather was John D. Rockefeller, the oil tycoon who was, at the time, literally the richest man on the planet. And his father, Nelson Rockefeller, was the governor of New York and would later become the vice president of the United States. But Michael wasn't interested in a life of politics or business. He had found his true calling in the remote jungles of New Guinea. He had first come to the island 7 months earlier as part of a film crew from Harvard University. They were there to document a remote tribe, and Michael simply fell in love with the raw adventure of it all. During that trip, while filming a battle between two tribes, he had even been accidentally shot in the shoulder with an arrow. But instead of being scared off, the experience only deepened his connection to the place. In fact, he never even told his powerful family about being wounded. He was worried that if they found out, the Rockefellers might seek some kind of retribution against the tribe that had inadvertently hurt him. Michael was incredibly respectful and protective of the people he met in New Guinea. In many ways, he felt more at home with them than he did with his own family. So after the Harvard film crew finished their documentary and went back to America, Michael stayed behind. Around that same time, his father, Nelson, had opened a new museum in New York City called the Museum of Primitive Art. It displayed artwork from places exactly like New Guinea. Now, this was the early 1960s, and many Westerners viewed the indigenous people of New Guinea as primitive or savage. So, a lot of people went to the museum out of a kind of morbid curiosity to see what these backwards people were creating. But Michael had a much deeper understanding. He felt it was his personal mission to find the most incredible art New Guinea had to offer, like the Asmat bis poles, and send it back to his father's museum. He didn't want it to be a spectacle. He wanted people in the West to see the beauty and complexity of this art and to respect the people who made it, just like he did. So he had teamed up with Renee, the French anthropologist, to travel all around the island searching for these masterpieces. A few hours after Simon and Leo had jumped into the sea, Michael and Renee had no way of knowing if the boys had even made it. No rescue boats had appeared on the horizon. For all they knew, they were completely on their own. And their catamaran was sinking lower and lower. At one point, they started grabbing buckets and desperately bailing water out, but it was a useless effort. The water was coming in way too fast. Then a large rogue wave slammed into them, and the entire catamaran flipped over, throwing Michael and Renee into the rough sea. Luckily, they were both able to surface and swim over to the overturned boat. There was an air pocket trapped underneath the hulls, which was keeping it afloat. So they just held on, with Michael also using an empty gas canister he had tied to his belt as an extra flotation device. They just floated there, holding on to the wreckage, hoping that Simon and Leo had made it and that help was on the way. But in the back of his mind, Michael knew that if help didn't come soon, he would have to do something drastic. He would have to attempt that swim to shore himself, a shore that was now much, much farther than half a mile away. By the next morning, as the sun rose over the Arafura Sea, Michael and Renee were still in the water, still clinging to the boat. No help had come. Michael was an excellent swimmer, but by now he estimated they were at least 5, maybe even 10 miles from the coast. It would be a monumental swim in very dangerous, choppy water. But Michael was a Rockefeller. He was confident, and he had an unshakable belief in his own abilities. He started telling Renee that he was going to do it. He told him, "I can make it. I know I can swim the whole distance, even if it's 10 miles. You just hang tight. It'll take a while, but I'll get us help." Renee pleaded with him not to go. It seemed like suicide. But Michael was determined. He said he had to do something, otherwise they were both going to die out there. And so, all Renee could do was watch as Michael stripped off some of his clothes to reduce drag, attached a second gas canister to his belt for more buoyancy, and then, after shaking Renee's hand, he turned towards the distant shore. At around 8 a.m. on Sunday, the 19th of November, 1961, Michael Rockefeller started to swim. About 12 hours later, that night, Renee was still alone, holding on to the catamaran, exhausted and losing hope. Suddenly, the sky above him erupted in a brilliant flash of light. A plane was flying overhead. They had spotted him and had fired a flare to let him know that help was on its way. Just a couple of hours after that, a boat appeared and pulled Renee from the water. As he climbed aboard, weak but overwhelmingly relieved, he asked the captain if Michael had sent them. He asked if Michael Rockefeller had made it to shore and told them where he was. The captain looked at him and said no. He told Renee they had been alerted by 2 teenage guides, Simon and Leo, who had made it to shore hours earlier. No one had seen or heard from Michael at all. As soon as that news was relayed, it was like an explosion went off within the Rockefeller family. They mobilized everything. All of their money, all of their resources, all of their political influence was brought to bear on one single goal: finding Michael. They launched what was probably the largest and most expensive manhunt in history up to that point. They dispatched private ships, helicopters, and planes. They got the U.S. Navy involved with their own fleet of vessels. They scoured every inch of the coastline and the open sea for weeks. But they found absolutely nothing. No sign of Michael anywhere. The search would unofficially continue for years. It was never as intense as it was in those first few weeks, but there was always someone, some entity funded by the Rockefellers looking for Michael in that area. But by 1964, 3 years after he had started that swim, the family finally had to accept the inevitable. They concluded that Michael must have drowned. He had likely succumbed to exhaustion or the currents during that impossibly long swim to shore. And that became the official story. In America, that's what everyone believed happened to Michael Rockefeller. His sister even wrote a best-selling book about the family's grief and the process of accepting his loss. But in New Guinea, a very different story began to spread. Rumors about Michael's true fate were whispered along jungle trade routes. They were shared between visiting missionaries and gossiped about in the pages of sensational tabloids and adventure magazines. In 1969, 5 years after Michael was officially declared dead, an adventure magazine reporter named Milt Macklin heard a wild story from a mysterious Australian source. This source claimed that he had actually seen Michael Rockefeller alive, living deep in the New Guinea jungle, not far from where his boat had gone down. Despite how unbelievable it sounded, Milt Macklin decided to follow up on the tip. He put together a film crew and flew to New Guinea. He went to the exact area where the source claimed to have seen Michael, and he launched his own investigation. He spoke to locals, he trekked through the jungle, he scoured the region, but he found no sign of Michael. Milt, feeling defeated, eventually returned home. He ended up writing his own best-selling book about his failed quest to find the lost Rockefeller heir. But here's the crucial detail. Even though he had shot hours and hours of film footage of the tribes in that area, both from a distance and up close, he and his team never really went back and reviewed it. They shot it, didn't find Michael, and just put all the film cans into storage. 40 years later, another documentary film crew decided they were going to make a film about the enduring mystery of Michael Rockefeller. The rumors that he was still alive and living in the jungle had never completely died out. Before this new crew went to New Guinea themselves, they did their research and they managed to uncover all of that old, unwatched footage from Milt Macklin's 1969 expedition. They sat down and began to watch all of it hour after hour. And that's when they found something that no one could believe. Buried in all that footage was a single brief shot. It was filmed from a distance with the camera on land looking out towards the water. A long war canoe filled with Asmat warriors paddles into the frame. It's clearly a war party on their way to a battle or a raid. But as the camera holds on the canoe, you can see that among the dark-skinned, powerfully built Asmat men, there is one person who stands out completely. He is a naked, bearded white man. And even though the film quality was poor and the shot was from far away, he looked, for all the world, like an older Michael Rockefeller. As soon as this footage was made public, the story went viral. The old rumors exploded into a full-blown global theory. The heir to one of the world's greatest fortunes hadn't died at all. He had survived his swim, been accepted by the Asmat, and had chosen to turn his back on his family and his old life to live as one of them in the jungle. Now, of course, there was no way to prove it was really him. It could have been a missionary, or a trader, or some other white person who happened to be in that remote part of the world. But the story was just too incredible, and it spread everywhere. In 2012, more than 50 years after Michael Rockefeller disappeared, a National Geographic journalist named Carl Hoffman decided he was going to be the one to finally get to the bottom of the mystery. He had been fascinated by the story since he was a kid. He and an interpreter traveled to New Guinea, to the very region where Michael had been last seen. They didn't just visit. They lived with the Asmat people for months. They learned their customs, they earned their trust, and eventually they earned their respect. And after months of this, the village elders began to tell Carl a new story. It was a story he had never heard before, the real story of what had happened to Michael. But they gave him a very serious warning. They told him that if he ever repeated what they were about to tell him, the entire village would likely be killed in retaliation, and maybe he would be killed too. But Carl didn't listen. After he heard the truth, he left New Guinea and wrote a book about it called Savage Harvest. And according to that book, this is what really happened to Michael Rockefeller. On the morning of the 19th of November, 1961, about 24 hours after Michael had jumped into the sea and started his long swim, a group of about 50 Asmat warriors were resting. They were in 8 long canoes, gathered at the mouth of the same river that had caused Michael's boat to capsize. 3 of the tribe's elders, men named Finn, Ajim, and Pep, were among them. They weren't really going anywhere. They were just relaxing after a long journey, some smoking loosely wrapped cigars, others chewing on a starchy flower made from a palm plant. They were all naked, except for a few decorative bands on their arms and legs. Some had intricate bone piercings through their noses and ears. It was a peaceful scene. Then, suddenly, Ajim, one of the elders, spotted something out in the water. It was a white object moving slowly from the open sea into the mouth of their river. It was slithering through the water. Ajim immediately called out to the others. He shouted that there was something coming, maybe a white crocodile or a sea serpent. They all turned to look. Slowly, this strange white thing was getting closer and closer. Not wanting to be caught by surprise, the entire group of warriors readied their weapons and began paddling their 8 canoes out to intercept whatever it was. If it was a threat, they would deal with it. As the canoes converged on the object, some of the men had their spears raised, ready to strike. But when they finally got close enough to see it clearly, they realized it wasn't a monster. It was a man. A white man. He was floating on his back, exhausted, with two strange containers tied to his belt. He was clearly not a threat. At once, the warriors lowered their spears. Some of them even laughed, relieved that there was no danger. The white man, Michael Rockefeller, rolled over in the water and looked up. He couldn't believe his eyes. After swimming for nearly a day, he had been found by the very people he had been trying to reach. He thought they were there to rescue him. Almost crying with relief, he swam the last few feet and grabbed onto the side of one of the canoes. As he held on, one of the elders, a man named Pep, looked down at Michael. Then Pep looked up at the other two elders, Finn and Eugene. They just stared at each other for a long moment. They looked back down at Michael, then back at each other, and then all three of them gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was an agreement. Pep then reached down and helped a completely exhausted Michael into the canoe. Michael immediately collapsed in the bottom of the boat, just overcome with relief and fatigue. He just lay there as the Asmat warriors turned their canoes around and began paddling back up the river inland. As they paddled, all 50 of them in all 8 canoes began a strange rhythmic chant. It was a powerful, unified sound that echoed across the water. Michael, who had studied Asmat culture, had never heard this particular chant before. He was mesmerized by it. He tried to ask the men in his canoe what it meant, but they completely ignored him. They just kept paddling and chanting, so Michael just lay back, listening, letting them carry him to what he believed was safety. Then, all at once, the chanting stopped. The canoes turned and pulled into a small, muddy inlet that led to a clearing on the riverbank. Michael noticed they were slowing down, so he propped himself up and looked over the side of the canoe, expecting to see their village. But there was no village. It was just an empty clearing. Right away, Michael started to feel a sense of urgency. He thought, I need to get to their village so I can find someone to contact the authorities. They need to go rescue Renee. They need to find Simon and Leo. He started trying to ask the men in his canoe for help, but the language barrier was immense. Neither side could understand the other. Then one of the Asmat men just started laughing at Michael. When he did, the rest of the warriors looked over, saw what was happening, and they all began to laugh too. A chorus of laughter directed at him. Michael had no idea what was going on. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the laughing stopped. In an instant, they were all back to that strange, rhythmic chanting. The warriors began to climb out of their canoes and wade onto the shore. Michael started to sense that something was very, very wrong. Instead of getting out of the canoe with them, he instinctively lay back down, almost as if he was trying to hide. As he did this, the same tribesmen who had first laughed at him stood over him, still chanting. He smiled down at Michael. And then he raised his spear and drove it directly into Michael's side. The second the spear went in, other members of the tribe raised large ceremonial horns and began to blow them, a loud, bleating sound. Michael screamed in pain, but he was too weak to fight back. He rolled over to his other side, trying to protect himself, and the man just smiled, lifted his bloody spear, and drove it into Michael's other side. After pulling the spear out, Michael, now in horrible pain but running on pure adrenaline, managed to pull himself up and over the side of the canoe. He fell out into the mud and tried to stand up, tried to get away, but he had nowhere to go. As he fumbled in the mud, 2 of the tribesmen walked up behind him, grabbed him under his arms, and began to drag him. They carried him across the clearing and into the jungle. And as they walked, the rhythmic chanting and the periodic blasting of the horns continued. They dragged Michael through the jungle until they reached another, more hidden clearing, nowhere near their village. They took him to the center of it, and forced him onto his knees. Michael was hunched over, clutching his bleeding sides, surrounded by a circle of chanting warriors. Then, one of the tribesmen walked up to Michael, grabbed his head by the hair, and pushed it forward, exposing the back of his neck. Another warrior stepped into the circle. The chanting grew louder. The horns blew again. This second man raised a stone axe high over his head and brought it down with full force onto the back of Michael Rockefeller's neck. It turns out the Asmat tribe knew exactly who Michael was. They remembered him from his visit months earlier when he had tried to trade for their bispoles, and they had been deeply offended. They couldn't believe that this rich, white outsider had shown up and thought he could just buy one of their most sacred objects, an object containing the souls of their ancestors, as if it were just some trinket to be put on a sleeve in a faraway museum. They held on to a deep resentment for him. That was why they never sent the pole. They were never going to give it to him. So, when Michael had, by some strange twist of fate, floated right into their river, the three village elders, Finn, Ajim, and Pep, saw it as a sign. That look they exchanged, that nod, was an agreement. They were going to ritualistically kill Michael. His death would be the vengeance they needed to release the souls of their fallen warriors trapped in the bispoles, especially the souls of those who had been killed by white men in the past. Michael was going to pay for the crimes of others. That chant Michael had heard was the chant they performed during their execution ritual. And they didn't just kill him. After the axe came down on his neck, another tribesman stepped forward with a knife. He grabbed Michael's hair, pulled his head back, and severed it from his body. Then, as the chanting and horns continued, other members of the tribe moved in and began to systematically dismember Michael's body. They cut him to pieces, separating his organs, his flesh, and his bones into different piles. They quickly got a fire going. And then they cooked and ate him. Of all the parts of his body, his brain was considered the most powerful prize. Only the three elders, Finn, Ajim, and Pep, were allowed to eat it. After they had finished the feast, they wrapped up the remaining meat in leaves to take back to the village and eat later. Finn, one of the elders, took Michael's skull. He would bring it back, cover it in banana leaves, paint it, and keep it as a trophy. A few days later, when that massive Rockefeller-funded search party descended on the area, the Asmat tribe knew they could never say a single word about what really happened. If the story got out, they were certain that Westerners would come and exact a terrible revenge on their entire village. And so, for decades, their secret was safe. It was only passed down through oral tradition until the journalist Carl Hoffman finally heard it and published it in his book. But, despite the book and its detailed, horrific account, there were always questions about its credibility. The story of Michael Rockefeller was already so full of mystery and strange theories. And so, to this day, the Rockefeller family and official authorities have never acknowledged this version of events. The official story remains unchanged. Michael Rockefeller drowned while swimming to shore to get help. That's it. Thank you so much for watching. To this day, no one knows for certain what happened to Michael Rockefeller out there on the coast of New Guinea. Maybe he drowned during that impossible swim to shore. Or maybe the story whispered among the Asmat people for decades was true all along. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to check out our other true crime and mystery stories. And if you have your own theory about what really happened to Michael Rockefeller, let me know down in the comments. Until next time. In October of 2014, a 35-year-old woman, who we will call Olivia, was going about her normal day in Western New York. It was a crisp, cool autumn day, the kind of day where the leaves are turning vibrant shades of orange and red, and there is a slight chill in the air. Olivia had planned a simple, quiet day, but she was looking forward to one specific event. She was going to meet her husband for lunch at a local restaurant. They had not seen much of each other during the busy work week, so they wanted to sit down, catch up, and enjoy a nice meal together. When they arrived at the restaurant, they were greeted by the warm aroma of fresh food, and they were seated at a comfortable table in the corner. Originally, they had not planned to stay at this restaurant for very long. They figured they would grab a quick bite, chat for maybe 45 minutes, and then get back to their respective schedules. But as they started talking, they realized how much they had missed each other's company. The conversation flowed effortlessly, and they found themselves laughing and sharing stories about their week. One thing led to another, and before they knew it, the hours were just flying by. They ordered some appetizers, which included a large basket of warm, freshly baked bread. They ate the bread with butter, enjoying every bite. Then they ordered their main courses, which consisted of large plates of pasta covered in rich, heavy sauces. They talked through the entire meal, and when they finished, they decided they were having such a good time that they did not want it to end just yet. So they ordered some cakes and other desserts, along with some coffee. By the time they finally looked at their watches, they were absolutely shocked to see that it was 6 in the evening. They had been sitting at that restaurant for 6 hours. Over those 6 hours, both Olivia and her husband had consumed a massive amount of food. They had eaten multiple baskets of bread, heavy pasta dishes, and sweet cakes. Along with all of this food, they had also ordered some alcoholic drinks. However, because both of them knew they had to drive home afterward, they were extremely careful about how much they drank. Olivia made sure to pace herself very strictly. Over the entire 6-hour period, she only had 4 alcoholic drinks. Since she had spread those 4 drinks out over such a long time, she knew she would be completely sober and safe to drive. Her husband was equally cautious, limiting his own drinking to make sure he was well under the legal limit. After they got the check and paid for their large meal, they walked out to the parking lot. The sun had already gone down, and it was dark outside. They said their goodbyes, gave each other a hug, and hopped into their respective cars to begin the drive home. As Olivia was driving down the dark roads of Western New York, navigating the familiar turns, she suddenly heard a loud, jarring pop from the front of her car. The steering wheel violently jerked in her hands, and the vehicle began to pull heavily to the right. She immediately realized that she had gotten a flat tire. Olivia kept her cool, slowly steering her car off to the side of the road, and pulled over onto the shoulder. She put the car in park, turned on her hazard lights, and pulled her phone out of her purse. She called roadside assistance to report the flat tire and asked for a tow truck or a mechanic to come out and help her change it. As she was waiting inside her warm car, she decided to step outside for a moment to look at the damage. The air was cold, and she stood near the front passenger side tire, which was completely flat and resting on the rim. At this exact moment, another motorist happened to drive past her on the dark road. This driver saw Olivia standing outside her car with a severely deflated tire. In the darkness, the driver completely misunderstood the situation. They did not see a woman waiting for roadside assistance. They thought she had just been in a major car accident and might be in shock or injured. Concerned for her safety, the passing motorist decided to call the police and report that a woman had been in an accident on the side of the road. A few minutes later, a police car pulled up behind Olivia's vehicle. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the dark road. 2 police officers got out of their cruiser and walked up to Olivia. They asked her if she was okay and if she had been involved in an accident. Olivia smiled, trying to reassure them, and said that she was totally fine. She explained that she had simply gotten a flat tire and was just waiting for roadside assistance to arrive. She thanked them for stopping to check on her. But as the officers stood there listening to her speak, they began to notice some classic signs of intoxication. They saw that her eyes looked glassy and glazed over, which is a common indicator of alcohol consumption. Furthermore, as she was speaking to them, they could have sworn she was slurring her words and speaking a bit slower than normal. This made the officers highly suspicious. They looked at her and asked if she had been drinking tonight. Olivia, wanting to be honest, told them that yes, she had had a few drinks, But she quickly explained that she had only consumed 4 drinks over the course of a 6-hour lunch, and she insisted that she did not feel drunk at all. She told them her flat tire had nothing to do with her drinking, and she was completely sober. The police officers, however, were not buying her story. Her physical appearance and the way she was speaking did not match her claim of being sober. They decided to put her through a series of field sobriety tests. They had her step away from her car and perform several physical tasks. They had her walk in a straight line, placing her heel to her toe, turn around, and walk back. They had her stand on one leg while counting out loud. They also did the eye test, where she had to follow a pen with her eyes without moving her head. Olivia managed to complete the tests, but she struggled with them just enough to send up some major red flags for the officers. At this point, they were convinced she was impaired, so they pulled out a breathalyzer device and asked her to blow into it. A breathalyzer is a small handheld tool that measures the amount of alcohol in a person's system by analyzing their breath, giving a reading of their blood alcohol content, or BAC. In the United States, the legal limit for operating a motor vehicle is 0.08%. To give you an idea of what that means, if a typical 160-pound woman were to drink about 3 or 4 alcoholic beverages in a single hour, her BAC would likely rise to right around that 0.08 limit. If that same woman were to consume 8 drinks in an hour, her BAC would spike to 0.20%. At that level, she would be incredibly drunk, unable to function, and would likely be suffering from alcohol poisoning, eventually losing consciousness. And if she were to drink 13 alcoholic drinks in an hour, her BAC would jump all the way up to a lethal 0.40%, which is a level where a person is at risk of dying from alcohol toxicity. Olivia was completely confident when she took the breathalyzer. She knew she had only had 4 drinks over 6 hours, which meant her body should have easily processed the alcohol, leaving her well below the legal limit of 0.08%. She blew into the tube and waited for the device to register her level. When the numbers appeared on the screen, the police officers stared at it in complete shock. They looked at each other, then back at the screen, and then at Olivia. The device read a staggering 0.33%. This was an impossibly high number. At a 0.33% BAC, a normal human being should be slipping into unconsciousness or actively dying. Yet here was Olivia, standing on the side of the road, speaking to them, and appearing only slightly buzzed. The officers immediately assumed that their breathalyzer machine must be broken or malfunctioning. It was the only logical explanation. So they walked back to their patrol car, grabbed a completely different breathalyzer device, and brought it over. They had Olivia blow into the second machine, but when the second reading popped up, the result was exactly the same. She blew a 0.33% BAC once again. The officers were completely mystified by how this woman could have such an extreme, superhuman tolerance to alcohol. But regardless of their confusion, they had to follow the law. They charged her with driving while intoxicated, placed her under arrest, and decided to transport her straight to the local hospital so medical professionals could intervene and monitor her safety, given how dangerously high her alcohol levels were. When she arrived at the hospital, doctors immediately admitted her and began running blood tests. But as the hours rolled by, the mystery only grew deeper. A full 24 hours passed, during which Olivia was kept in a hospital room with absolutely no access to alcohol. Yet, when doctors tested her blood again, her blood alcohol content was still incredibly high. It made absolutely no sense. How could someone who had not consumed a single drop of alcohol in 24 hours still have a massive amount of alcohol in their system? The doctors were completely baffled, and they began running a series of specialized medical tests to figure out what was happening inside her body. It was during this extensive medical investigation that they made a shocking discovery. It turned out that Olivia had an incredibly rare and bizarre medical condition known as autobrewery syndrome. In simple terms, this condition meant that her digestive system had a unique imbalance of yeast and fungi that literally acted like a brewery. When Olivia consumed carbohydrates or glucose, such as the bread, pasta, and cakes she had eaten during her 6-hour lunch, her digestive system would ferment those sugars and turn them directly into pure alcohol inside her body. Olivia had been completely unaware of this condition her entire life. She had developed an incredibly high tolerance to alcohol over the years because her body was essentially brewing its own alcohol all the time, making her constantly drunk without her even realizing it. She was not a heavy drinker, but because she ate normal carbohydrates like bread and pasta, her body was constantly producing its own supply of alcohol. The doctors explained that if this condition is left untreated, it can cause the exact same severe organ damage, liver failure, and cognitive issues as chronic heavy alcoholism. The only way to treat autobrewery syndrome is to make a drastic, permanent change in diet. Once Olivia's medical diagnosis was officially confirmed and made public to the court, the prosecutors realized she had no idea she was impaired and had not willingly consumed that much alcohol, so they dropped all the charges against her. Olivia was incredibly relieved, and she immediately made the decision to completely eliminate carbohydrates from her diet, resolving to never eat bread or pasta again to keep her body from brewing alcohol. Now, let us move on to our second story, which takes us back in time to the year 1887. In Paris, France, there was a 35-year-old man named Robert Ladru. Robert was an exceptionally talented detective working for the Parisian police force. He had a brilliant mind for details, an incredible ability to read people, and a logical approach to solving crimes that made him famous throughout the country. He was so skilled that whenever police departments in other towns and cities across France encountered a case that they simply could not solve, they would write letters to the headquarters in Paris and beg for Robert to be sent to help them. He was essentially the ultimate detective, a man who could see the tiny details that everyone else missed. In the spring of 1887, a peaceful, small coastal town in northern France was facing a terrifying mystery. Over the course of several months, a number of local sailors had suddenly gone missing. They would go out for walks or head down to the docks at night, and they would never return. No bodies were found, no signs of struggles were discovered, and the local police force had absolutely no leads or suspects. The townspeople were growing increasingly panicked, and the local authorities were completely out of their depth. So, they reached out to Paris and requested the assistance of Robert Ladru. Robert accepted the assignment and began the long journey from Paris to the northern coast. Traveling in those days was slow and tiring, and by the time Robert finally arrived in the small coastal town, it was extremely late at night. The streets were pitch black, and the cool ocean breeze was blowing through the empty town. Robert was completely exhausted from his travels, so he decided that he would not begin his investigation that night. Instead, he went straight to a local hotel, checked into his room, and went to bed, falling into a deep and heavy sleep. The next morning, Robert woke up feeling refreshed and ready to work. He got dressed, gathered his notebook, and walked down to the local police station to meet with the chief of police and the other officers he would be working with on the missing sailors case. But when he walked into the station, he noticed that the atmosphere was chaotic and tense. The officers were running around, talking in hushed, panicked voices, and there was a sense of urgency in the air. Robert walked up to the chief of police, who looked incredibly tired and stressed. The chief apologized to Robert and delivered some shocking news. He explained that the case of the missing sailors had suddenly been lowered in priority. The reason was that during the night, a brutal murder had been committed right on the town's local beach. This was the first murder the quiet town had seen in years, and the entire police force had to be mobilized to investigate it immediately. The chief told Robert that he was deeply sorry for bringing him all the way from Paris for the missing sailors case, only to change plans, but then he asked Robert if he would be willing to help them investigate this fresh beach murder instead. Robert, being a dedicated lawman, did not hesitate. He told the chief that he would be honored to assist them in any way he could. The chief began to share the details of the crime. The victim was a middle-aged man named Andre Monet. Andre was a well-respected man who owned a successful and popular dress shop in Paris. He had recently decided to retire or take a break from the busy city life, so he had bought a home in this quiet coastal town to relax and enjoy the beautiful ocean views. But early that morning, a local resident walking along the beach had spotted a body lying in the sand. It was Andre. The police had rushed to the scene and conducted an initial examination of the body. They determined that Andre had been killed by a single gunshot wound to the chest. The bullet had traveled with intense force, passing clean through his body and exiting out his back. But the problem was, the police had not been able to find the bullet anywhere in the surrounding sand. They had no suspects, no leads, and no obvious motive. The officers were able to rule out robbery almost immediately because when they searched Andre's clothing, they found that his wallet, his money, and all of his expensive jewelry were still completely intact on his person. Whoever had killed Andre had not done it for money. Robert, the chief of police, and several local officers left the station and walked down to the beach to examine the crime scene. The beach was a wide stretch of soft sand, bordered by a steep stone wall and a set of wooden stairs that led up to the main coastal road. The local officers immediately went to work near the spot where Andre's body had been found, dropping to their knees to sift through the sand, desperately searching for the missing bullet that had passed through the victim. Robert, however, decided to take a different path. He knew that the immediate area around a body is often contaminated by first responders, so he walked a short distance down the beach, keeping his eyes glued to the ground, looking for any subtle clues that others might have overlooked. After walking just a little ways away from the main scene, Robert stopped in his tracks. In the soft, damp sand, he noticed a set of footprints. They were barely visible, but they were definitely there. As Robert followed the footprints with his eyes, he saw that they came from the direction of the town, passed directly by the spot where Andre's body had been found, and then continued past the crime scene toward the wooden stairs. The prints went up the stairs and then disappeared completely once they hit the hard pavement of the road. Robert called the other officers over and showed them the footprints. He instructed them to immediately make plaster casts of the prints so they could preserve the evidence and analyze them. Making a plaster cast is a standard forensic technique. The officers would mix liquid plaster in a bucket, carefully pour it into the impressions in the sand, and then wait for it to dry and harden. Once dry, they would pull the hardened plaster out, and it would give them a perfect three-dimensional replica of the exact shape and size of the shoe or foot that had made the print. While the officers were busy preparing the plaster, Robert stood over the prints, staring at them with a look of deep concentration. One of the officers noticed his expression and asked him what he was thinking. Robert replied that the footprints looked incredibly odd to him. He said they felt strangely familiar, as if he had seen them somewhere before, but he simply could not place where or when he had seen them. Less than an hour later, the plaster had dried completely. The officers carefully pried the casts out of the sand, brushed away the loose dirt, and handed them to Robert. The moment Robert's hands touched the plaster casts and he looked down at the shapes, his body physically reacted. He gasped, his face went completely pale, and a look of absolute horror and disappointment washed over him. He did not say a single word to the officers standing around him. He simply turned around, holding the plaster casts tightly against his chest, and walked away. He walked down the beach to a highly secluded, rocky area where no one could see him. He sat down on a cold rock and placed the plaster casts in front of him. And then he just sat there. He sat there for hours and hours, completely motionless, staring intently at the white plaster shapes. The hours ticked by, and the hot afternoon sun blazed down on him, but he did not seem to feel the heat. The tide began to turn, and the ocean water started to rapidly creep up the beach, splashing against the rocks near his feet, but he did not move a muscle. He was completely lost in his own mind, staring at the plaster. The local officers watched him from a distance, utterly mystified by his behavior. They did not know what to make of this legendary Parisian detective sitting alone on the rocks for hours. But because of his massive reputation as a genius, they did not dare to interrupt him or ask him what he was doing. They simply assumed he was engaging in some highly advanced detective method that was far beyond their understanding. Finally, as the afternoon was beginning to fade, Robert stood up. He picked up the plaster casts, walked back over to the waiting officers, and looked them in the eyes. He told them that there was no reason to stay at the beach any longer, and there was no need to interview any more witnesses because he believed he had solved the case. But, once again, instead of elaborating or explaining his theory, he simply turned around, walked up the wooden stairs, and headed back to his hotel. The local officers looked at each other, completely baffled, and shrugged their shoulders. Having nothing left to do, they packed up their equipment and returned to the station. Early the next morning, one of the officers searching the beach finally found the bullet that had killed Andre Monet. It was buried deep in the sand near the crime scene. When Robert arrived at the beach later that morning to meet with the police, the chief of police walked up to him with a look of excitement and handed him the bullet, believing this would be the final piece of evidence Robert needed to arrest the killer. Robert took the small metal bullet, looked at it closely, and let out a deep, heavy sigh. He looked at the chief of police with tears in his eyes and said that now he knew for sure what had happened. He then proceeded to describe the murder in vivid, precise detail. Robert told the officers that on the night of the crime, the killer had woken up in the middle of the night in his hotel room. The killer had gotten out of bed, put on his clothes, and walked out into the dark night, heading straight down to the beach. While walking along the shore, the killer encountered Andre Monet, who was also out for a late-night walk. The two men had a friendly conversation at first, but at some point, a sudden and intense argument broke out between them. In a moment of anger, the killer pulled out his revolver, shot Andre directly in the chest, and then quickly fled the scene, walking back up the stairs to his room. The chief of police was amazed by this detailed reconstruction and asked Robert how he could possibly know all of this. Robert looked at him and said that he knew because he was the killer. He had killed Andre Monet. But he explained that he did not do it on purpose, and he had absolutely no memory of doing it because he had been sleepwalking. Robert explained that when he looked at the plaster casts of the footprints on the beach, he realized why they looked so familiar. The cast showed that whoever had made those prints was missing a toe. And, as it happened, Robert himself was missing a toe. The footprints in the sand matched his own feet perfectly. Furthermore, when he had woken up in his hotel room that morning, before he even knew a murder had occurred, he had noticed that his shoes and socks next to his bed were damp and covered in wet sand. He had thought it was strange at the time, but he was in a hurry to get to the police station, so he had ignored it. After spending hours staring at the casts on the beach, he had gone back to his hotel room and checked his personal revolver, which he kept hidden under his pillow. He always kept the gun fully loaded, but when he checked it, he was horrified to find that one bullet was missing. He spent the entire night trying to convince himself that it was all just a terrible coincidence, but when the chief of police handed him the bullet found on the beach, all doubt was erased. The bullet was the exact rare type of ammunition that Robert used in his personal gun. He had caught himself. The police were absolutely stunned. They could not believe that their star detective, a man of such high standing, was responsible for this terrible crime. They wondered if Robert was having a mental breakdown or if this was some incredibly elaborate cover-up. To test whether he was actually telling the truth about his sleepwalking, they decided to conduct a scientific experiment. Robert agreed to cooperate fully. The police placed him inside a secure jail cell where he would be monitored 24 hours a day by armed guards. They placed his personal revolver under his pillow, but they loaded it with blank rounds instead of live ammunition. They told him to go to sleep as he normally would. For the first few nights, nothing happened. Robert slept peacefully, and he never reached for the gun. But about a week into the experiment, in the dead of night, the guards watching the cell saw Robert suddenly sit up. He was in a deep trance-like state, his eyes wide open but completely vacant, staring into nothingness. He slowly reached his hand under his pillow, pulled out the revolver, aimed it directly at the guards standing outside his cell, and began firing the blank rounds. This terrifying demonstration completely convinced the police and the medical experts that Robert was telling the absolute truth. He had indeed killed Andre Monet while completely unconscious in a state of sleepwalking. Because he lacked any criminal intent or conscious awareness of his actions, the authorities decided that it would not be right to prosecute him for murder. However, they also recognized that he was incredibly dangerous to the public when he fell asleep. To protect everyone, they made the difficult decision to exile Robert. For the rest of his life, until he passed away in 1937, Robert Ladru was forced to live in complete isolation on a secluded farm far outside of Paris. The only people he ever saw were medical doctors who would visit him to study his condition. But even then, the doctors would only visit during the bright daylight hours, and they always made sure to bring armed bodyguards with them, just in case Robert were to fall asleep. Now, let us move on to our third and final story, which begins on the 18th of December, 1956, with the premiere of a brand new television game show called To Tell the Truth. This show was broadcast on a major American television network and quickly became a massive sensation across the country. The premise of the game show was incredibly simple, yet highly entertaining. In each episode, a panel of 4 celebrity judges would be introduced to 3 different contestants. All 3 of these contestants would claim to be the exact same person. This person was always someone remarkable, someone who had achieved something extraordinary, possessed an incredible talent, or lived a highly unusual and fascinating life. While all 3 contestants claimed to be this remarkable person, only one of them was telling the truth. The other 2 contestants were imposters who had been thoroughly briefed on the real person's life, and their job was to lie as convincingly as possible to trick the celebrity judges. During the show, the host would read a brief biography of the real, remarkable person. After the biography was read, the celebrity judges would have a set amount of time to ask all 3 contestants various questions about their background, their career, their achievements, and their personal lives. The judges would listen closely to their answers, trying to spot any lies, hesitation, or inconsistencies. Once the questioning period was over, each of the 4 celebrity judges would cast a vote for the contestant they believed was telling the truth. After the votes were tallied, the host of the show would look at the contestants and say the famous line, "Will the real person please stand up?" The true individual would then stand up, the audience would erupt in thunderous applause, and the imposters would smile and congratulate them. The show was incredibly popular, and it ran for decades, producing thousands of episodes that were watched by millions of Americans. For the most part, the episodes were very lighthearted, fun, and predictable. But there was one specific episode that would go down in television history as the absolute most unique, bizarre, and chilling episode ever recorded. Fast forward to October of 1972. On this particular evening, 3 clean-cut, polite men walked out onto the stage and took their places in front of the 4 celebrity judges. All 3 of them wore nice suits, smiled warmly at the audience, and introduced themselves as Ed Edwards. The host of the show then stepped up to his podium and began reading the biography of the real Ed Edwards. The biography was fascinating. The host explained that at one point in his life, Ed Edwards had been a highly dangerous criminal. In fact, he had been so prolific and dangerous that he had earned a spot on the FBI's list of the top 10 most wanted fugitives in America. He had committed multiple armed robberies, impersonated federal officers, and broken out of jail. But then, while serving a long prison sentence, a compassionate prison guard had taken an interest in him and helped him turn his life around. Upon his release from prison 14 years later, Ed had supposedly become a completely reformed man. He had written a successful autobiography, and he had become a popular motivational speaker. He traveled around the country talking to youth groups, civic organizations, and business leaders, teaching people how to identify con men, how to spot criminals, and how to protect themselves from being victims of crime. After this impressive biography was read, the three contestants sat down, and the celebrity judges began asking them questions. The judges asked about his time on the run, his experiences in prison, the process of writing his book, and how he had managed to change his life. All three men answered the questions with confidence, charm, and poise. When the time was up, the celebrity judges cast their votes. Two of the four judges correctly guessed which man was the real Ed Edwards. When the host finally asked the real Ed Edwards to stand up, a man in a neat suit and glasses stood up, smiling warmly. The audience clapped loudly, completely charmed by him. He did not look like an ex-convict or a dangerous fugitive. He looked like an ordinary, friendly, all-American father who lived next door, someone who loved his family and wouldn't hurt a fly. He seemed completely harmless, and the episode ended on a highly positive, inspiring note. After the episode aired, the public eventually forgot about Ed Edwards, and he faded back into ordinary life. But decades later, in 2009, a dark and terrifying truth would finally begin to emerge. Ed Edwards had a daughter named April Blasio. In 2009, April was a 40-year-old woman, but she had spent her entire childhood and adult life plagued by deep suspicion and fear regarding her father. Despite her father's public claims that he was a completely reformed man, a loving father, and a law-abiding citizen, April never believed it. Behind the closed doors of their family home, Ed Edwards was not a warm, charming motivational speaker. He was an incredibly violent, abusive man with a terrifying temper. He was also a compulsive liar who manipulated everyone around him. During the 1970s and 1980s, when April was just a young girl, her father would suddenly force the entire family to pack up all of their belongings and move to a new town. These moves did not happen with planning or preparation. Often, in the middle of the night, Ed would wake the children up, tell them to grab what they could, throw everything into the car, and drive away to a completely different state. April was always deeply unsettled by this. She assumed that her dad was constantly running from the law or involved in some sort of serious criminal activity. Whenever she or her mother would ask Ed why they had to keep moving so suddenly, Ed always had a quick, convincing explanation. He would tell them that when he was in prison, he had acted as an informant and had snitched on some highly dangerous people. He claimed that those dangerous criminals had finally tracked down where they were living, and so the family had to flee immediately to protect their lives. April knew deep down that her father was lying to her, but as a child, there was nothing she could do. They kept moving from town to town, state to state, never staying in one place for very long. But she could never shake the feeling that her father was hiding a much darker, more sinister secret. Fast forward to 2009. April was now 40 years old, and she was laying in her bed late one night, unable to sleep. Her mind began to wander back to her childhood and the strange, chaotic life her father had forced them to live. She decided that she was finally going to do some investigating of her own. She got out of bed, opened her laptop, and opened a search engine. She decided to start typing in the names of the various small towns where her family had briefly lived during her childhood. She decided she would type the name of a town, followed by phrases like unsolved murder or unsolved mystery, to see if anything had happened in those towns during the exact brief windows of time that her family had lived there. As she began her search, she went through several towns with no results. But then, she typed in the name of a town called Watertown, Wisconsin. Her family had lived there for a very brief period in 1980. When she pressed search, an article popped up that made her stomach drop. The article described an unsolved double homicide that had occurred in Watertown in August of 1980. A young teenage couple had been attending a wedding reception. At some point during the evening, they decided to leave the reception and drive down a quiet, dead-end road to spend some time alone together in their car. While they were sitting in the car, an unknown man had suddenly walked out of the darkness, approached the vehicle, broke inside, and shot both teenagers to death before disappearing into the night. The police had a vague description of the suspect, but they had never been able to solve the case. As April read the details of the crime, she realized that the murder had occurred during the exact small window of time that her family had been living in Watertown. Furthermore, the physical description of the suspect matched her father, Ed Edwards, perfectly. Acting on a strong gut instinct, April called the Watertown Police Department the very next day. She spoke to a detective and explained that she believed her father might be responsible for the 1,980 double murder. She explained that they had lived in the area at the time and that her father fit the physical description of the killer perfectly. She also shared her father's criminal history and his violent nature. The detectives were intrigued by her call. They decided to look into Ed Edwards, who was currently living in Kentucky as an elderly man. They tracked him down and managed to obtain a sample of his DNA. They sent the sample to a laboratory to be compared with the DNA evidence that had been recovered from the crime scene back in 1980. A short time later, the results came back. The DNA was a perfect match. Ed Edwards was indeed the killer. In 2009, police officers arrested Ed Edwards at his home in Kentucky and extradited him to Wisconsin to face charges for the double murder. As soon as Ed was placed in custody and realized that the police had his DNA, his entire demeanor changed. He did not deny the crimes. Instead, he immediately confessed to the murders of the young couple. But then, Ed did something very strange. He asked the prosecutors if he could receive the death penalty for his crimes. He was an elderly, sick man, and he seemed to want the state to execute him. However, the prosecutors explained to him that under Wisconsin law, the maximum punishment for his crimes was life in prison without the possibility of parole. Wisconsin did not have the death penalty. Ed was incredibly frustrated by this news. He did not want to spend the rest of his life rotting in a prison cell. So he decided to use his knowledge of other crimes as a bargaining chip. He reached out to detectives and confessed to another double homicide that he had committed back in 1,977 Inches, Ohio. In that case, he had targeted and murdered another young teenage couple. Ed believed that by confessing to these murders in Ohio, he would be eligible for the death penalty. But through a legal loophole and the specific laws of that state at the time, the prosecutors told him that he was still only facing life in prison. Even more frustrated, Ed decided to play his final card. He revealed a third, highly chilling murder that he had committed in 1996. He confessed that he had murdered his own foster son, a young man named Danny Boy Edwards. Ed had taken the young man in, raised him, and then killed him in cold blood in order to collect a massive double indemnity life insurance policy. Because this murder was committed for financial gain and involved a vulnerable victim, it met the legal criteria for capital punishment. Ed was finally convicted and sentenced to death, just as he had wanted. However, before the state could carry out the execution, Ed Edwards died of natural causes in a prison hospital in 2011 at the age of 77. But the story of Ed Edelum does not end with his death. Since his passing, cold case investigators, journalists, and even members of his own family, including April, have spent years looking into his life. They have realized that Ed Edwards is almost certainly responsible for many more killings beyond the 5 that he officially confessed to. In fact, some investigators have put forward a highly compelling and terrifying theory. They believe that Ed Edwards may actually be the infamous Zodiac Killer, one of the most notorious and elusive serial killers in American history, who terrorized Northern California in the late 1960s and early 1970s, claiming to have killed 37 people. While this theory has never been officially proven, the timelines, geographical locations, and psychological profiles of Ed Edwards and the Zodiac Killer match up in ways that are deeply unsettling. If this theory is indeed true, it means that when Ed Edwards walked out onto the stage of To Tell the Truth in October of 1972, stood in front of the flashing television lights, smiled warmly at the celebrity judges, and answered their questions with charm and confidence, he was not a reformed man at all. He was actively a highly prolific, active serial killer who had already taken the lives of dozens of innocent people. He was hiding his true, monstrous nature in plain sight, using a national television broadcast to show off his ability to lie and manipulate. Ed Edwards stopped confessing to murders after his third confession because he had gotten exactly what he wanted, which was the death penalty. Once he secured that sentence, he went completely silent, refusing to cooperate or share any more details about his past. And now that he is dead, the secrets of his true crimes have been buried with him. Without his cooperation, and with so many decades having passed, it is highly unlikely that investigators will ever be able to connect him to other unsolved cold cases. The families of his potential victims are left with unanswered questions, and we will likely never know the true, horrifying extent of Ed Edwards' reign of terror. These three stories show us that the world is full of strange, dark, and mysterious events that we can barely begin to comprehend. From a woman whose own body brewed alcohol, to a brilliant detective who hunted himself down, to a serial killer who stood smiling on a national television stage, the truth is often far more unbelievable than any fiction we could ever write. We must always remember to look closely at the details of our lives, because sometimes the most shocking revelations are hiding in the things we take for granted. Olivia had no idea that her simple love for bread and pasta was triggering a chemical factory in her stomach. Detective Robert Ladrew spent a lifetime solving the secrets of other people, only to realize his own sleeping body was carrying out a quiet tragedy on a lonely beach. And April Blasio had to grow up in the shadow of a father whose public life was an inspiring story of redemption, while his private life was a trail of blood and deception. These stories leave us with a lingering sense of mystery and a reminder that human behavior is complex, unpredictable, and sometimes deeply haunting. We are left to wonder about the secrets that still remain buried, the mysteries that have never been solved, and the quiet truths that are still waiting in the dark to be discovered. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.